You think you know what it means to be alone? You don't. Let me tell you about a man named Amos Blackwood. The year was 1877, and the prairie had already taken everything from him. His farm wasn't a home, it was a grave marker. A small, desperate island in a sea of whispering grass. The house leaned, tired of standing. The barn was a skeleton of old wood, picked clean by the wind. A year, a full year since the silence had come to stay. It wasn't just quiet, it was a weight, a physical pressure that started the moment the sun rose and didn't let up until the sky bruised into night. It was the silence left behind by his wife, Martha, and the child she took with her into the cold ground, buried next to the only cottonwood tree for miles. Amos didn't live anymore. He haunted. His grief wasn't loud. It was a dull, permanent ache deep in his bones. It was the empty chair across the table. He still talked to her, his voice a low rumble against the howl of the wind. "Ground's getting hard, Martha," he'd say, looking out at the fields that were supposed to be their dream. Now they were just dirt, dirt that wanted sweat and blood he didn't have left to give. He was a hollow man, a shell of routine. Wake, work, eat, sleep, repeat. Loneliness was in the single cup he washed. It was in the cold, untouched side of the bed. It was in the echo of his own boots on the floorboards. The land felt it too, giving him nothing but stubborn roots and thirsty soil. His neighbors? A half-day's ride away. They were hard people, with no time for another man's sorrow. They'd see him in town, a ghost with eyes that looked right through you, and they'd keep their distance. He was a man drowning, and nobody had a rope to spare. Summer had been lean. Now autumn was painting the prairie in the colors of a beautiful, slow death. Winter was coming. You could feel it in the air, a new edge to the wind that promised ice and isolation. And in the corner of his decaying barn sat his entire future, a single fat bag of seed corn. It was the best of last year's crop, the last thing he and Martha had chosen together. It was everything, the promise of spring. The only thing standing between him and absolute ruin. Without that seed, the farm would die. His memories of Martha would die. Everything would be swallowed by the grass. That bag was his last prayer, his final bet against the wilderness. And it was on an afternoon, under a sky the color of a lead coffin, that he saw them. They were just specks at first, shimmering in the distance. Not riders, people on foot, moving with a slow, exhausted rhythm. As they got closer, his hand went to the old rifle by the door. You heard stories on the frontier, stories told in low voices, stories that made your blood run cold. He watched, every muscle in his body tight as a wire. The specks resolved into a man, a woman, and a small child. They were Cheyenne, he could tell by their clothes. The man walked in front, proud, but Amos could see the exhaustion carved into his face. The child, a boy maybe 5 years old, clung to his father's leg, his big dark eyes locked on the farmhouse. But it was the woman who stopped Amos's breath. She was heavy with child. Her steps were a painful shuffle. Her face was gaunt, her skin stretched tight over her bones. She leaned on the man for support, and every step looked like it might be her last. They stopped a ways from the porch. The man didn't speak. He just stood there. His gaze wasn't begging. It was a statement as harsh and plain as the land itself. We are starving. Every rational thought in Amos's head screamed at him. Send them away. You have nothing. You have a winter to survive and one bag of seed. The ugly whispers of his time, the fear and suspicion between settlers and natives, hissed in his ear. But then his eyes found the woman again. He saw the tired slope of her shoulders, the protective hand on her swollen belly, and the wall around his heart, the one he'd built stone by grieving stone, didn't just crack, it shattered. Because in her, he saw Martha. He saw the last week of her life, her body weary but her eyes bright with the promise of the baby she carried. The phantom pain of that loss hit him like a physical blow, knocking the air right out of his lungs. The rifle by the door suddenly felt like a disgusting, useless thing. This wasn't a threat. This was a family about to be erased. Go away, Amos heard himself say. His voice was a rusty croak. The words tasted like ash. He didn't mean them. He knew it the second they left his mouth. The Cheyenne man didn't flinch. He didn't even look at Amos. His eyes just flickered to his wife. A universe of fear and love and desperation passed in that one tiny glance. And in that moment, the world shrank. There were no settlers, no natives, just two men. Two fathers standing on opposite sides of a deep, dark canyon of history, united by the single primal terror of not being able to protect their family. A war raged inside Amos. His mind, the practical part, the terrified part, screamed about the seed corn. It was his survival. It was the only logical thing to do. Protect the seed. But his heart, that broken and sleeping thing, saw Martha's face in the Cheyenne woman's eyes. What good was survival if it meant becoming a man who could watch a woman and child starve? What future was worth building on that kind of foundation? He would be truly alone then, haunted not just by grief, but by a shame colder than any winter blizzard. Without another word, he turned. The screen door slammed shut behind him, a period on a sentence he hadn't spoken. He walked through the silent kitchen, past Martha's empty chair, and straight into the barn. The air was cool and smelled of hay and failure. There it was, the bag. It seemed to glow in the dim light, a beacon of everything he was about to throw away. He hefted it onto his shoulder. It was heavy, heavy with corn, heavy with dreams, heavy with the future he was about to give away. He walked back out onto the porch. He didn't stop. He walked right past the steps, his boots kicking up dust, until he stood right in front of them. He looked from the man's stoic face to his wife's, and then down to the small, scared boy. He didn't say a word. He just swung the bag off his shoulder. It landed on the dry ground with a soft, final thud. The sound of his future hitting the dirt. The Cheyenne man, Mochedavato, just stared at the bag. He looked up at Amos, his eyes wide with a disbelief so deep it was almost painful to see. He was searching for the trick, the hidden price. There had to be a catch, but he found nothing in Amos's gaze. Amos just gave a small, tired nod, a gesture that said, "Take it. It's done." Slowly, like a man in a dream, Mochitavato reached down and touched the burlap sack. He looked at his wife, Vivina, and a whole conversation passed between them without a sound. Then he straightened up. His pride seemed to return, but it was different now, transformed. He looked Amos square in the eye, and he placed a hand over his own heart. It was a gesture of thanks so immense, so solemn, that no words were needed. Words would have made it smaller. He shouldered the bag, a burden that was now a blessing. He helped his wife turn, and they walked away. The small boy, still clinging to his father, glanced back one last time. They receded into the vastness they came from, their figures shrinking until the prairie swallowed them whole, leaving Amos Blackwood utterly and completely alone. Alone with the wind, the silence, and the empty space where his future used to be. But as he turned to go back inside, a glint of light from the dust caught his eye. Something they had dropped. He bent down, his fingers closing around a small, cool piece of metal. It was a silver locket. He clicked it open, and the world stopped turning. Inside wasn't a Cheyenne woman. It was a small, delicate portrait, a photograph of a white woman with blonde hair, a gentle smile, and familiar eyes. Eyes that looked exactly like his dead wife, Martha. Amos stood there, the cold metal pressing into his palm, the wind whipping around him. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, roaring silence in his head. Martha. It couldn't be, but it was. Her smile, the way her hair fell. It was her. But how? His mind raced, stumbling over itself. The locket was old, tarnished at the edges. The picture was faded, but it was her. He would know that face anywhere. He'd spent years memorizing it, tracing it in his memory until it was more real than the world around him. Who were those people? The thought hit him like a physical blow. They weren't just a starving family. They were something else, something dangerous. Had they known Martha, robbed her grave? The idea was so monstrous he felt sick. He stumbled back to his porch, sinking onto the steps, the locket clutched in his hand like a venomous insect. He had just given away his entire future, his last hope. He'd done it out of a moment of shared humanity, a memory of his wife's suffering. And it was all a lie. A trick. He felt a rage so pure and hot it burned away the grief and the loneliness. He was a fool. The biggest fool on the whole damn prairie. He'd been played. They saw a lonely, broken man, and they took him for everything he had. That gesture, the hand over the heart. It wasn't gratitude. It was mockery. He spent the rest of the day in a daze, pacing the small cabin, the locket opening and closing in his hand. Click, Martha's face. Click. Darkness. Click. A ghost smiling at him. Night fell, but he didn't light a lamp. He sat in the dark. The Cheyenne family's faces burned into his mind. The stoic man, the helpless woman, the child. What was their game? Were they thieves? Killers? Had he just funded their escape after some terrible crime? The winter came on fast after that, like it was in a hurry to bury him. The first snows were heavy, blanketing the world in a sterile white. With the seed corn gone, a terrible sharp clarity settled over Amos. He hadn't just given away food, he'd given away the machinery of hope itself. His own small stores of food vanished with terrifying speed. The last of the salted pork was gone by Christmas. The jars of preserves Martha had canned, each one a sweet memory of a better time, were emptied one by one. Soon he was down to a handful of dried beans and a scoop of flour. Hunger became his constant companion, a clawing, gnawing thing inside him. It made the silence of the cabin louder. It made the ghost of Martha feel further away. Some days he'd just sit and stare at the wall, the cold seeping into his bones, and he'd wonder if he'd gone mad. A fool's choice, Martha, he'd whisper to the empty room, the wind rattling the window pane. I gave it all away for a ghost. He tried to put the locket away. He buried it in a small wooden box with Martha's other things. But he couldn't leave it. He'd find himself digging it out, staring at her face, then at the strange, foreign metalwork of the locket itself. He examined it with a magnifying glass he used for fixing tools, and that's when he found it. A tiny, almost invisible inscription scratched into the silver on the back. It wasn't a name. It was a set of letters and a date. E.M., and a date from just over a year ago. E.M., not M.B., for Martha Blackwood. He frowned, his mind churning. E.M. The letters meant nothing to him, but the date, it was just a few weeks before Martha and the baby had died. Could there be a connection? His paranoia grew with his hunger. He started seeing things, or thought he did. Shadows moving at the edge of his property, a flicker of movement in the distant snowdrifts. He'd grab his rifle and stare out the window for hours, his heart pounding, but there was never anything there, just the wind and the endless, blinding white. One morning he woke to find a fresh set of tracks in the snow near his well. They weren't his, and they weren't from any animal he recognized. They were from a single person wearing moccasins. They walked right up to the well, stood there for a moment, and then walked away, disappearing back into the plains. He was being watched. The knowledge didn't just scare him, it burrowed deep into his soul. Were they coming back for more? Did they think he had something else to give? Or were they waiting for him to starve, to grow weak, so they could just walk in and take the farm itself? The letters E.M. gnawed at him. He remembered something, a conversation in the general store months ago, before he'd stopped going. People talking about a family, the Millers. They lived 2 days' ride east. They'd vanished. Just gone. Man, wife, and their young son. The settlement marshal said they'd probably just packed up and headed for Oregon, but the rumors were darker, that they'd been taken. The wife's name, he strained to remember. Eleanor. Eleanor Miller. E.M. The blood drained from his face. It couldn't be. A coincidence. It had to be. But the picture in the locket. If you were grieving, if you were desperate, couldn't you make a stranger look like the one you'd lost? Had he seen Martha in that picture because he wanted to? He dug out the locket again, his hands shaking. He stared at the face. It was so close, so painfully close to his Martha. But maybe the chin was a little different, the eyes a slightly lighter shade of blue. The terrible truth began to dawn on him. The family he'd helped, Mochetavado, Vavina. They weren't just thieves, they were kidnappers, or worse. The woman in the locket, Eleanor Miller, was their prisoner. And the woman he saw, the pregnant one, who was she? Was she Vavina at all? Or was she Eleanor disguised, forced to play a part? Was the man Mochettavato really her husband or her captor? He felt a wave of nausea. He hadn't just given away his future to con artists. He'd given it to monsters. He had been their accomplice. He had funded their escape. That bag of seed wasn't just feeding them. It was feeding their crime. It was keeping their victim alive until what? The guilt was a heavier weight than the grief had ever been. He had failed Martha by letting her die. Now he had failed this other woman, Eleanor, by helping her captors. He was cursed. Everything he touched turned to ash. The winter deepened. His body wasted away. His clothes hung on him like sacks. The simple act of chopping firewood left him breathless, his vision spotting with blackness. The farm decayed with him. The fence fell. Shingles blew off the barn roof. He was too weak, too hopeless to fix any of it. He was a man coming undone, piece by piece. There were nights he thought about the rifle, a quick, clean end to the hunger and the guilt. But two things stopped him: the faint memory of Martha's hand in his, and the image of that child, Eleanor Miller's son, or the Cheyenne man's. He didn't know, but the boy's eyes, they had been filled with fear. One night, the wind howled louder than ever before, screaming like a banshee. In the morning, when the world was silent again, he found something on his porch. A small, carved wooden bird. It was placed neatly on the top step. Cheyenne work, he knew. Simple, elegant, and unmistakable. It wasn't a threat. Not exactly. It felt like a marker, a sign, a message he couldn't read. You are not forgotten. We are still here. We are still watching. He threw the bird into the fire, but he couldn't burn away the feeling it left behind. The feeling of being tangled in a story he didn't understand. A story that was going to pull him under, one way or another. The last of his flour was gone. He was mixing snow into a thin, tasteless gruel made from boiled leather scraps. He survived, but it wasn't living. It was a hibernation of the soul. Spring finally came, not with a gentle thaw, but with a muddy, ugly retreat. The snow melted, revealing the dead brown earth. For a farmer, spring should be a time of hope and energy. For Amos, it was a joke. He stood on his porch looking at the vast, empty field. A blank page he had no ink to write on. The ground was hard. The plow was dull. The mule was as thin as he was, and he had no seed. The field was a monument to his stupidity, a vast, silent accusation. The fight was gone. He had made his choice back in the autumn, and this was the price, the end of the line. The prairie would take the farm back, and he would simply fade away. He sank onto the porch steps, head in his hands, defeated. He spent a week like that, waking up, looking at the impossible field, and letting the weight of it crush him back into his chair. He had saved a family of monsters, and in doing so, he had damned himself. A bitter, lonely end. It was on a morning just like all the others that his world changed again. He was on the porch nursing a cup of boiled chicory root, staring at the endless brown, when he saw it. Movement on the horizon. Not a few figures this time. This was a dark line, a smudge against the pale sky that grew wider and wider. This wasn't a family. This was something else entirely. As the line grew closer, it resolved into riders, dozens of them, then 100, then more. His heart started hammering against his ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage of bone. This was it. The stories, the warnings, the deep, dark dread of the frontier. A war party. He scrambled inside, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grab the rifle. He had no illusions. One man against how many? He peered through the dirty window, his finger on the trigger. He tried to count but lost track. It looked like 200 warriors, a river of men and horses, flowing silently, unstoppably, toward his lonely farm. They were Cheyenne. A cold knot of dread formed in his stomach. They were coming back, not with thanks, not with gratitude. They had played him once, and now they were coming back to finish the job, to take the farm, the mule, his life. His act of kindness had been seen for what it was: weakness, an invitation. He was a fool, a dead fool. He stood behind the door, the rifle heavy and useless in his hands, and waited for the end. He braced for the war cries, the thunder of hooves, the splintering of his door. But none of that came. The riders stopped. They came to a perfect, silent halt just at the edge of his field, a formidable, terrifying wall of men and horses. The only sound was the jingle of harnesses and the soft snorting of the ponies. The air grew thick with a tension so heavy he could barely breathe. Then one rider detached himself from the group. He rode forward alone. As he drew closer, Amos's breath hitched in his throat. It was Mochetavado. He looked different. He wasn't the starving, desperate man from the fall. He sat tall on his horse, his face strong, but it wasn't serene. It was grim, hard as rock, and he wasn't alone. He was flanked by two other warriors, their faces painted, their eyes cold and hostile. Mochetavado stopped his horse 30 yards from the porch. He dismounted. Amos slowly, cautiously opened the door. He left the rifle inside, a useless gesture, but it was the only one he had left. He felt impossibly small and frail as he stepped out onto the porch. Mochetavado walked toward him. His steps were measured, deliberate. He stopped a few feet from Amos. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The 200 warriors watched from the field, a silent, deadly jury. Then Mochetavado spoke. His English was clear, perfect, but his words were not what Amos expected. He didn't say, "You have no seed." He held up his hand, and in it, dangling from a silver chain, was the locket. "Where?" Mochetavado asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Did you get this?" The question hung in the air, cold and sharp as a blade. Amos was no longer a victim. He was a suspect. The world had tilted on its axis again, and he was falling. I found it," Amos stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "You dropped it, the day you came here." Mochetavado's face was a stone mask. He showed no sign of believing him. The warrior to his right, a man with a brutal scar across his cheek and eyes like chips of obsidian, sneered. "He lies," the scarred warrior said in his own tongue, but his meaning was clear. "This belonged to a great man," Mochetavado said, his eyes boring into Amos. "It belonged to my brother. He was killed, murdered, by a white man. We followed his trail for months. It ended here, at this farm." Amos's blood ran cold. This wasn't about the seed. It wasn't about Eleanor Miller. It was about a murder, and they thought he was the killer. "No," Amos said, shaking his head, taking a step back. "You don't understand. The woman, the pregnant woman—" "My wife is fine," Mochetavado snapped. "My son is fine, because of the corn you gave us. But you did not give it out of kindness. You gave it out of guilt. You gave it to the brother of the man you murdered." This was a nightmare, a fever dream. "I've never seen your brother. I haven't left this farm in a year," Amos pleaded. The scarred warrior, whose name was Stonehand, stepped forward. He pointed a finger at Amos, then gestured to the lone cottonwood tree, to the small, simple cross marking the grave. "Then who is buried there?" Stonehand demanded. "Is that where you put him, after you took this from his body?" They thought Martha's grave was the scene of their crime. They thought he was a killer, hiding his victim in his own wife's resting place. "That's my wife's grave," Amos cried out, his voice cracking with anguish and terror. "My wife and child." Stonehand just laughed, a cruel, harsh sound. "A convenient story." Mochetavato looked at the grave, then back at Amos. For the first time, a flicker of something other than certainty crossed his face, but Stonehand was already moving. "We will see," he grunted, turning and shouting an order to the warriors. Several of them dismounted, grabbing tools from their horses. Not plows, shovels. They were going to dig up Martha's grave. The horror of it was absolute. Amos felt a surge of adrenaline, of pure primal rage that burned away his fear and weakness. He wasn't going to let them. He didn't care if they killed him. He launched himself off the porch, a wild scream tearing from his throat, aiming for Stonehand. It was a pathetic, desperate attack. The warrior sidestepped him easily, grabbing him and throwing him to the ground like a sack of rags. The air exploded from his lungs. He lay in the dirt, gasping, helpless, as the warriors with the shovels approached the grave. This was the end, his final humiliation. They would desecrate his wife's memory, and then they would kill him for a crime he didn't commit. He closed his eyes, whispering Martha's name. "Stop!" The voice was not loud, but it cut through the tension like a knife. Amos opened his eyes. Riding from the back of the assembled warriors was a woman on a pony. It was Vavina. She was no longer pregnant. In her arms, wrapped in a deerskin blanket, was a newborn baby. The boy, her son, rode behind her. She slid off the horse and walked toward them, her face filled with an authority that made even Stonehand pause, shovel in hand. She stopped beside her husband, Mochedavato. She looked at Amos on the ground, then at Stonehand, and finally at the locket in her husband's hand. "He is not the one," she said, her voice clear and strong. Stonehand grunted in disbelief. "Vavina, the trail led here. The locket, the trail was a lie," she said. "And this man's heart is true. I saw it in his eyes that day. He gave us his last hope. A murderer does not have such eyes." She turned to her husband. "My love, you are blinded by your grief. This is not justice. This is a mistake." Mochetavato looked from his wife to the locket, then to Amos, who was struggling to his feet. The certainty in his face was crumbling, replaced by a terrible, dawning confusion. "Then who?" Mochetavato whispered. "Who killed my brother?" "The same man who has been poisoning the wells between our people for a year," Vavina said. "The man who trades lies as easily as he trades furs. The man we were fleeing from that day." Amos's mind was spinning. Fleeing? Not kidnappers? "A trapper," Vavina continued, her eyes finding Amos's. "A white man with a black heart. His name is Silas." The name meant nothing to Amos. "Silas attacked our winter camp," Vavina explained, her voice trembling slightly at the memory. "He killed Mochetavato's brother and 2 others. He wanted the locket. My husband's brother had just won it in a trade. Silas claimed it was his. So the locket wasn't Eleanor Miller's. The picture inside, it was just a coincidence. A cruel, impossible coincidence that had sent Amos down a spiral of paranoia and self-hatred for an entire winter. The face that looked like Martha was a random woman in a locket traded for, fought over, and killed for, 100 miles away. "We ran," Vavina said. "He followed us. We were starving when we found this place. This man, he did not see enemies. He saw a family. He saved us. He saved your child." She looked pointedly at Mochetavato, shifting the baby in her arms. Stonehand was still skeptical. "Why would the trail lead here? Why would Silas let you go, only to send us to the wrong man?" "Because he is clever," a new voice said. It was the young boy, speaking for the first time. His voice was small but steady. "He followed us. He watched from the hills. He saw my father drop the silver circle. He saw this man pick it up. He saw the gift of corn." The boy looked at his father. "He made a new trail for you to follow while he disappeared. It was a perfect trap. Silas, the real killer, had watched the entire exchange. He saw a way to not only escape, but to set his pursuers on a collision course with an innocent man. He could let the Cheyenne and the settlers destroy each other, while he slipped away free and clear. He'd probably been spreading rumors in the settlement too, painting Amos as a crazed hermit who was in league with the natives, covering his tracks from both sides. The truth settled over the farm, heavy and undeniable. Amos wasn't a fool. He wasn't an accomplice. He wasn't a killer. He was a pawn in a much darker game. Mochetavato looked at Amos, his face a canvas of shame and regret. He took a step forward, his hand outstretched. Crack! The sound of a rifle shot ripped through the air. It was sharp, loud, and terrifyingly close. One of the warriors standing near the barn cried out and crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading across his shoulder. Chaos erupted. Warriors dove from their horses, taking cover. Mochetavato shoved Vavina and his sons behind him, pulling them toward the relative safety of the farmhouse porch. Another shot kicked up dirt near Stonehand's feet. Silas, the trapper, had been here the whole time, watching from the low hills that bordered the western edge of Amos's property. He'd seen his brilliant plan fall apart, and now he was resorting to a new one. Start a massacre and slip away in the confusion. If a dozen warriors and a settler ended up dead, who would be left to tell the tale? His crimes would be buried under theirs. Amos, who seconds ago had been a condemned man, was now suddenly on the same side as his accusers. Mochitavato scrambled onto the porch, pulling Amos with him. "Where's your rifle?" he yelled over the sound of another shot splintering the porch railing. "Inside," Amos yelled back. He crawled through the door, grabbed the rifle and a box of cartridges, and crawled back out. Stone Hand and a handful of other warriors had taken cover behind the water trough, laying down covering fire with their own rifles toward the hills. "He knows this land better than we do," Mochitavato shouted to Amos. "Is there another way to get to those hills?" Amos's mind, which had been foggy with hunger and despair for months, was now razor sharp. This was his land, his home. He would not let some faceless killer burn it down to hide his own sins. "There is," Amos said, his voice steady for the first time in a year. "A dry creek bed. It runs behind the barn. It will take us right to the base of that hill. He'll never see us coming." Mochitavato nodded, his eyes filled with a new respect. "Stone Hand, cover us!" The scarred warrior, without hesitation, nodded and increased his rate of fire, his bullets kicking up dust and rock all around Silas's position, forcing the trapper to keep his head down. "You, me, and him," Mochitavato said, nodding at Amos. He barked an order, and another warrior joined them. The four of them scurried from the porch, keeping low, and sprinted for the cover of the barn. Wood chips exploded from the barn wall as Silas got a shot off at them, but they made it. They scrambled down the muddy bank into the dry creek bed. It was a narrow, winding trench hidden from view. Amos took the lead. He knew every twist, every turn. He was no warrior. He was a farmer. But this was his earth. They moved quickly and silently. The sound of the gunfire faded, becoming distant pops. Amos's heart was a drum in his ears. He wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting for his home, for Martha's memory, for the quiet peace he had lost and desperately, impossibly, wanted back. He held up a hand, signaling them to stop. He peered over the edge of the creek bed. They were at the base of the hill. About 50 yards above them, tucked into a rocky outcropping, was Silas, a rough-looking man with a thick beard, reloading his rifle, convinced his flank was secure. Mochitavato looked at Amos, a question in his eyes. Amos just pointed. The four of them fanned out, crawling up the hill through the tall grass, silent as ghosts. They closed the distance. 40 yards, 30, 20. Silas must have sensed something. He turned, his eyes widening in shock as he saw four figures rising from the grass, rifles leveled at him. He was trapped. "Don't shoot!" Silas yelled, dropping his rifle and raising his hands. "It was him, the farmer. He's the one who killed your man. He's been working with the Arapaho, trying to start a war." He pointed a trembling finger at Amos, his last desperate lie. Mochitavato and the other warrior hesitated, their rifles wavering between Silas and Amos. The old suspicion, for a split second, flickered in their eyes. But Stone Hand didn't hesitate. He had seen it all now. He had seen Amos's pathetic, desperate courage when he charged him to protect the grave. He had seen the truth in Vavina's eyes. And he had seen the farmer, starved and weak, lead them without fear across his own land to corner a common enemy. He knew who the killer was, and he knew who was a man of honor. Stone Hand didn't fire his rifle. He moved. With a speed that was breathtaking, he closed the remaining distance, grabbed Silas's outstretched arm, twisted it, and sent the trapper sprawling to the ground with a cry of pain. He kicked the man's rifle away and stood over him, his face a mask of cold, hard justice. It was over. The silence that fell was profound. The gunfire had stopped. The shouting was done. The only sound was the ever-present wind blowing across the prairie. They marched Silas back down the hill. He was a prisoner now, his lies broken, his evil exposed. When the other warriors saw him, a low murmur of understanding went through the ranks. They saw the truth in the trapper's terrified eyes. The wounded warrior was being tended to by Vavina. His wound was painful, but not fatal. The crisis had passed. Mochitavato walked over to Amos, who was standing by his porch, rifle hanging loosely in his hand, looking at the chaos on his farm. He looked at the divots in the dirt from the bullets, the splintered wood of his home. Mochetavado stopped in front of him. He held out the silver locket. "This is yours," Mochetavado said. "A false ghost that haunted you. It brought us nothing but pain. Perhaps it will bring you peace." Amos looked at it, at the face that was so like, and yet so unlike, his Martha. He shook his head. "It belongs to no one now. Let the prairie have it." He took the locket and threw it as far as he could into the tall grass. They watched it disappear. A ghost finally laid to rest. Stone Hand approached, his face no longer hostile. He stopped before Amos and did something that shocked him. He placed his fist over his heart, a warrior's salute, a gesture of profound respect. "You are a strong man, Amos Blackwood," he said. "You fight for your home." Amos could only nod, his throat thick with emotion. Mochetavado turned and gave a sharp, clear call to his men, and what happened next was the second miracle Amos had witnessed on his farm. It was not an attack. It was not an apology. It was something more. With a quiet discipline, the 200 warriors dismounted. They went to their horses, but this time, they weren't grabbing weapons or shovels. They were unlashing tools, heavy horse-drawn breaking plows, hand plows, and sacks. Dozens and dozens of heavy burlap sacks. They fanned out across his field, the field that had been a symbol of his failure and despair. At another call from Mochetavado, they began to work. The silence was broken by the creak of leather, the grunt of men, and the rhythmic sound of blades slicing into the hard-packed earth. They moved in long, straight lines, turning the soil with an efficiency that was beautiful to watch. The field that was his insurmountable obstacle was being tamed, furrow by furrow. These men, warriors, hunters, were stooped in a farmer's labor, their powerful shoulders bent to the task of plowing a stranger's land. This wasn't just a debt being paid. A bag of corn for this? It was no equal trade. This was a statement, an alliance forged in blood and misunderstanding and truth. This was a promise, written in the very soil of his farm. Mochetavado stood beside him on the porch. He pointed to the group of men unloading the heavy sacks by his barn. "We bring seed," he said simply. "More than you gave." Tears welled in Amos's eyes. He didn't fight them this time. He looked at the Cheyenne leader, this man he had hated, feared, and fought alongside. "Why?" Amos choked out. "Why all of this?" Mochetavado looked from the field, now almost entirely plowed, back to Amos. He placed his hand over his heart, the same gesture he had used months ago. But now Amos understood its true meaning. "You fed my son," he said. "You fed my wife, who carried my new daughter. You saved my family. A man who does this when he has nothing is a man of a great spirit. My people, we do not forget. A gift of life is answered with a gift of life." He gestured to the vast, dark, perfectly plowed field. "Today we have taken a great evil from this land. Now we will plant a great good. You will eat. Your house will be strong again. This land will not be a place of sorrow. It will be a place of peace, a bridge between our people. This is our way." By late afternoon it was done. The entire field was plowed. The dark furrows lay neat and ready, waiting for the seed that now sat in a mountain of sacks by his barn. The warriors gathered their tools and mounted their horses. They assembled one last time into that silent, formidable line. With a final nod from Mochetavado, they turned and left as they had come. They flowed back into the prairie, a receding river of men, until they were just a dark line on the horizon. And then, they were gone. Silas was gone with them, to face their justice. Amos Blackwood was left standing alone in the vast silence. But it was a different silence now. It wasn't empty. It was full. It echoed with the impossible kindness he had been shown. He walked down from his porch, his boots sinking into the soft, freshly turned soil. He knelt, picking up a handful of the rich, dark earth. It crumbled in his palm, cool and full of promise. The weight of the last year, the grief, the loneliness, the hunger, the paranoia, it all seemed to lift from his shoulders, carried away with the departing riders. He was no longer just a man grieving what he had lost. He was a man humbled and remade by what he had been given. He looked out at the prairie. It wasn't an enemy. It wasn't a void. It was a place of surprising, breathtaking grace. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over his field, his home. For the first time in a very long time, Amos Blackwood looked toward the coming day, not with dread, but with a quiet, powerful hope. He had a field to plant. He had a life to live. This story shows that you never truly know the ripples that your actions will cause. A single choice, a single moment of compassion can change the world in ways you can't possibly predict. It proves that even in the deepest darkness, a single seed of hope can grow into a forest. If you were moved by Amos's story and believe in the power of unlikely connections, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. We've got more stories like this one coming, and you won't want to miss them.